Okay, it's time for us to start. I know people will be coming in because that's what happens. But we're here right now with Michael Kraemer, and he was going to be telling us about Sheet'ká labor during Sheet'ká Tlingit labor during the Russian colonial period. So, Michael.
All right, well, Jack, thank you very much. I appreciate it, and thank you all for coming. I also very much appreciate it and very excited to give this presentation today. So, Shia awadnech yak yak satini tlikat yuhan Michael Kraemer yu khat dwasako shawama anik ye khat sati Washington Kwan away yuhan Gunstish Sheet'ká Kwan Gunstish hat yi adi. Thank you very much for being here. First, it's a pleasure to be here. My name is Michael Kraemer. I'm a PhD candidate in history at Ohio State University. I live on the land of the Shawnee. Please forgive me for any mistake I made in my introduction. I am still studying Tlingit and trying my best. And I'm very happy to see you. Thank you again for coming. And of course, thanks again for the organizers of the Sharing Our Knowledge Conference and everyone who's put together this really amazing conference. It's been excellent. Today I will be talking about the history of Sheet'ká and the history of the Russians who came here and tried to colonize Sheet'ká, and I would argue failed effectively. The Russians controlled very little land here. They had very little power over Tlingit people, and in fact, it's the Sheet'ká Kwan who actually significantly modified Russian colonial systems. And the Russians had to respond to what Sheet'ká Tlingits chose to do. And one of the reasons I sort of got into this research was I had read books by Russian historians and Alaska historians, and I felt like that Tlingit history was sort of written out of the Russian colonial history. The Russian colonial history was these Russian governors who got dictates from St. Petersburg, and then they perfectly implemented their plans. And I don't think that's the case when you actually look at what happened here in Sheet'ká. So I hope to just give a sample of the research I've done on this, and sort of share this with the community. And specifically, I'm going to be talking about Sheet'ká labor in the 1840s and 1850s, though I will give some background leading up to that. Because Tlingit labor was actually really important for the Russians, and it was really important for Russian industry here in Sheet'ká. And without that labor, the Russians really couldn't have survived here, and the Russians definitely could not have made a profit here. So with that, I'll go ahead and get started. And I'll leave as well time for questions at the end. But of course, if you all want to ask questions, feel free to raise your hand, and we can have a larger discussion on stuff too. So I'm first going to start with the early Sheet'ká Kwan Russian relationship. And as many of you know, you know the story of the war. You know the story of the Kiks Adi survival march. But I wanted to give sort of a brief overview. So the Russians arrive here in 1799, and the Russians arrive here under the auspices of this thing called the Russian-American Company, which was a monopolistic company that was essentially run by the Russian state, but run also by private actors. And at the time, it's run by Alexander Baranov, who runs the company with an iron fist. He has like full control over kind of their activities. And it's worth to know what the Russians do in Western Alaska, in Onegach and Sugpiaq territory, is they enslave the people there. And they enslave the people to hunt sea otters for them. And so Russian colonization in the 1700s is very violent. It's very coercive. And they did the same thing in Siberia, where they established these ports. They enslaved indigenous Siberians to hunt furs for them, and then they sent those furs off to China and made a big profit off of them. And so when they arrive in 1799, this is the sort of empire that arrives here. It's very coercive, it's very violent, and they're trying to do the same stuff here. Because they've pushed away a lot of the sea otters in Western Alaska, and they think they're going to find a lot in Tlingit Ani. and they want to sort of steal the sea otters from Tlingit. So they arrive here in 1799. They arrive in Kiks-Adi territory, and pretty quickly, the sort of men of the Russian-American company, these sort of very violent promyshlenniki or fur traders, start trying to do the same stuff that they were doing in Western Alaska. And they start a lot of disputes and they start fights against the Kiks-Adi. And they routinely insult the Kiks-Adi. They've arrived on their land and they've stolen essentially parts of it. And so pretty quickly, the Kiks-Adi are like, no, we're gonna kick these guys out. And so they start an uprising against the Russians. And the Kiks-Adi go throughout all of Tlingit and get other clans to support them against the Russians. And 10,000 Tlingit, rise up, fight against this sort of invading and very coercive force. And as sort of many of you know, this is a war that is a war that Russia, the Russian-American company, doesn't really win. They actually established a fort called Slavorasi up in Yakutat country. The Yakutat Tlingit and Iyak combined together, burned down that fort, and the Russians never had a fort up there again. And one of the only reasons why the Russians are able to reestablish themselves here in Sheetka, here at Novoarkhangelsk, is because the Kiks-Adi defenders run out of gunpowder during the battle. And so the Kiks-Adi make a decision to relocate instead of come under control of this coercive empire. And so the Kiks-Adi moved to the north of She Island, and they set up a blockade against the Russians. And this is where the history, I think, gets very interesting, because often the history ends here. We don't learn about what actually the Russians did here, and we don't learn about the relationships that happened after this point. And so, and I think this is a very important part of the story, because the Kiks-Adi set up this blockade, and this blockade is actually very successful, because the Russians effectively are living on stolen Kiks-Adi land, and they're having to try to survive here, and they don't know what they're doing. They don't know how to grow food out here. They don't know how to properly harvest resources. And so they bring pigs, they bring chickens, they bring cows. The cows starve to death because the Russians can't grow hay out here. The pigs often have their tails ripped off by ravens. And their flesh often tastes really, really fishy because all the Russians have to feed them is fish. And so the Russians hate the taste of the pigs that they bring. The chickens are often killed by the ravens. And so all the sort of European domesticated animal, can't live in a temperate rainforest here. We know what the climate of Tlingit is. It's ridiculous they're even trying. And then they bring all their crops. They bring wheat, they bring barley, they bring oats. They try to grow it, they fail. They can't actually grow anything because these sort of September rains come, and this wheat doesn't. These wheat and oats often doesn't come to maturity. And so the other interesting thing about it, though, is the Russians also try to build a lot of houses here in Kiks-Adi land, and a lot of these houses they don't know how to properly treat the wood. Because they don't know how to live in this rainy environment. Siberia is very cold, but it's also very dry. And so they're used to that environment. They're not used to the environment here. So what this means is that they have to cut down a lot of trees near their settlement. And they keep cutting down trees, going from 1 mile to 2 miles away from the settlement. And that starts to be a problem for them because they're constantly having to rebuild their houses. And the further away they get from the settlement, the more they're exposed to danger because the Russians don't control much, right? They just control a small area of modern-day Sitka. And so there are instances of Russian lumberjacks trying to go out into Kiks-Adi territory, cut down trees, and there's an incident in 1818 where the Kiks-Adi find 2 Russian lumberjacks and kill them for trespassing. And that freaks out the Russians, and so they kind of just sit stuck behind their walls in this small little town. And so the Russian occupation during this time is really a complete disaster. And Herb Hope, Stonuk, talks about in the Kiks-Adi Survival March that Dauenhauer's published in the 1990s in that oral history. he talks about how the Russians and Baranov send Russian envoys to the Kiksadi, say, please come back, come back. We need your trade goods. Come trade with us. Come. We'll give you our wealth for your food and for your wood. And the Kiksadi continuously refuse. They say, no, we're not coming back. And Baranov is eventually brought up on charges in Russia and actually transferred out of Russia because of his treatment of Alaska natives, and as well for a variety of different reasons. So Baranov's recalled from Russia, and this new governor in 1821 takes over by the name of Muravyov. And so it's at this point that some really important things happen in the Sheet'ká-Russian relationship, because Muravyov shows up to this town that's falling apart. Only half the buildings are actually standing at this moment. He doesn't actually have enough buildings to even actually house Russian-American company employees. So half the employees are living on their ships off the coast. And it's around this point that the Kiksadi send envoys and come to Muravyov and say, we would like to resettle here, and we're going to come resettle here, and we're going to build our houses here, and we will trade with you. We'll trade you foodstuffs. We'll trade you timber, but you are not allowed outside of this small colonial town. And any Russians or any employees of the Russian-American company who are found outside of this town will be killed for trespassing. And Muravyov kind of looks at this colonial town that's right, it's his old map of it's right here. And he's like, half of my buildings are falling apart. We don't have any food. Yeah, great. Yes, please come here. That'd be wonderful. And he even writes a letter to the Russian-American company and claims it was his idea. It wasn't his idea, and then the oral histories show that it wasn't his idea. But regardless, that starts a new relationship. And the relationship that gets started here is really, really important, because effectively what the Kiksadi have done is they have set up a regular trading relationship with the Russians, and they've set up a new agreement. And the agreement is basically that the Russians are allowed to live on Kiksadi land, but they will be trading goods to the Sheet'ká under the terms that the Sheet'ká want. So, I think it's an open question. Is this colonization? Or is this in fact an oral treaty? Is this in fact an agreement? And is this in fact a trading post here? And so, I was realizing, kind of ironically titled The Russian Colonial World. Well, if we're talking about the Russian colonial world in Tlingit, it's about 1 square mile right here. And so I think that, but it's really important to understand that initial trade agreement, because it affects Russian Tlingit relations all the way through while the Russians are here in Tlingit. And you actually can't understand important parts of the history here in Sheet'ká without understanding this initial agreement. So I wanted to give that brief overview, but then I'll sort of get into these issues of trade and the resources that are being traded. And so again, if I made any mistakes, I apologize. But I want to go over a few of the resources here, because the Russian-American company first wants foodstuffs from the Sheet'ká. And so they get fish often. They get khat, they get yao, they get halibut, and other fish. The Russians don't smoke them; they just brine them in salt because the Russians don't know how to. But this is enough to sort of give some protein to the Russian-American company employees, who really are subsisting off of these grain shipments that come every year. And so, a lot of these people are thousands of miles from their homes. They're thousands of miles from their family. They're working for a fairly monopolistic company. They're being paid poor wages, and they're not used to this climate. And and they're very depressed. And so, getting a little bit of protein in their diet helps a lot. It really sort of increases their sort of well-being. And so the Russians are really interested in trading for foodstuffs. They also trade for deer. They trade for mountain goat. And often the officers of the Russian-American company will often keep the good food for themselves. And the employees will get fish soup or meat soup or something like that, just a little bit of meat. So that's kind of how they ran it. But the other thing they need is they need timber. And so they need chai, or yellow cedar. and they need Sheet'í. Now, Sheet'í grows kind of nearby their settlement, but Khai they often can't get. And so that the timber trade with the Sheet'ká becomes very important because they need that yellow cedar to actually repair their ships. And without that, they often can't repair their ships. And so this becomes really, the Russians need this trade agreement simply to subsist here in Tlingit and keep their company running. And a lot of the sort of earlier period in the 1820s and 1830s is about keeping that company running. But the Russians start to get comfortable. They now have enough food, they now have enough timber, they're actually able to properly repair their homes and houses in Novoarkhangelsk. And so they start getting interested in trying to make some money. Because one thing that's happening while they're in this large territory we now call Alaska is they're running out of sea otter to hunt because they've really depleted a lot of the sea otter. And in fact, it's the Russian-American company sets up a conservation program where they won't hunt sea otter every 5 years to try to let the sea otter replenish. And so what that means is they're not making as much money from furs. And so they're trying to trade Tlingits for furs. They get some, but they need a new way to make money. And so one thing they start doing is they start building sawmills in Novoarkhangelsk. And so this governor, Governor Baron Ferdinand Petrovich Wrangel, who's a Baltic German, he's not ethnically Russian, he kind of comes to this area and he's like, oh, this is great. We got enough food. We got enough timber. Let's try to sell this timber down south. And so he constructs a sawmill intended for a timber export industry. The goal is to use that timber, make nice lumber boards that they can ship off to Hawaii, to the Kingdom of Hawaii, and eventually off to San Francisco during the gold rush later on, and make some money off of it. But again, the town's often rotting, and so a lot of this in the 1830s, it still doesn't get exported. Most of it gets used for construction here or construction on Kodiak. Their settlements on Kodiak don't have access to enough timber, so they're often shipping Tlingit timber to Kodiak Island as well. The other thing they do is establish this Tlingit market for feeding Russian-American company employees and start really buying a lot of Tlingit foodstuffs in bulk. So their sort of expansion of infrastructure continues. And so Governor Etelin, this Finnish governor in the 1840s, establishes a new sawmills in town. And at Huatkin Aku, or Swan Lake, just a short walk north. And there's also a lot more construction in the town, and there's repairing of structures. And at this point, now the main office sort of sends letters to Etelin and to other subsequent governors, and they really start making a push to get some of this timber exported to San Francisco. And sort of another sort of interesting thing as well is that Governor Etelin really reaches out to other Tlingit clans and gets trade agreements with other Tlingit clans around Tlingit. And so Kaikiani Haida actually bring a lot of potatoes here to sell to the Russians. And so the most successful Russian governors in Novoarkhangelsk are usually the ones that are focused on getting trade and making agreements, not fighting battles or fighting wars, but opening themselves up and trying to make agreements with Tlingit peoples here. And so, and Etelin as well sort of expands Tlingit labor in the town. He actually starts hiring Tlingit workers to work on construction projects in the town, work on ships to unload and load up sailing vessels. And this is around the time as well that many Sheet'ká Tlingit men actually come to the Russians and they want this labor because Tlingit men find that they can actually get paid a slightly better wage working for the Russians on a daily basis as opposed to trading them foodstuffs. And so I was looking at the details of this. I think like one halibut often could be sold for about one ruble or so. But just 1 day's of work, you get one ruble salary, and that's sort of guaranteed income. And the Russians even sort of regularize this to where you can get paid 1 ruble a day for an entire month doing work projects. And so Tlingit men start actually demanding this work from the Russians. And that's one sort of interesting thing about this. And this is one of the pictures of the old sawmills in town from the Alaska State Library. But this is one interesting thing about this is that the Russians often feel forced to actually hire Tlingit laborers because Tlingit men will often come at times when the Russians don't need a lot of laborers, but the Russians are a little bit worried about refusing them because there's a couple of times where this governor after Etelin, this guy named Tepinkov, actually refuses around 50 Tlingit men who come to work for the Russian-American company, and they go home very angry, actually. And he's like, oh no, they might stop trading us food. This might start a conflict. Better make some work to employ them, right? And so, so we're already starting to see a power relationship here in the 1840s and the 50s, where Sheet'ká Tlingits can come and demand labor when the Russians don't really need it, and the Russians don't give this labor. That's showing that the Russians are trying to keep a good relationship with the Sheet'ká Tlingit. And so there are regularly Tlingit laborers in the port, around 50 to 100 every year. And this is where things start to get a little bit bad for the Russians because the Russians are relying on Sheet'ká Tlingits to do too many things. They're saying we want foodstuffs. They're saying we want timber. They're saying we want more timber so we can export it to San Francisco. And oh yeah, would it be great if you could also unload ships, do construction projects in the in the town. So the Russians have a huge labor problem here. And you might ask, where are the Russian-American company laborers? Well, many of them are sick. Actually, 25% of the men employed by the Russian-American company are often sick and can't work. And there just simply are not enough laborers for the Russians to do what they want to do. I mean, it takes a lot of work to go out into the forest and cut enough timber and feed it through sawmills to produce enough lumber that you're actually going to make a profit off of it. And there's a reason why lots of the lumber industry tends to pop up in places where there's a sort of settler colonial environment, and you constantly have settlers coming in. And this is not Russian America. The Russian American company can't get people out here. At most, it's usually around 1,000 people living and working here, and that's just counting the workers, right? Family members, children often aren't doing work, and so the Russians have a labor problem here, and they're trying to use Sheet'ká Tlingit labor in order to paper that over, and this is where they start running into trouble, because what happens is when Tlingit men come and get money by working on construction projects, they're like, we don't need to go get food and trade that to the Russians. We can make more money working for them. So we're not gonna actually send food to the market. And they also start refusing to send more lumber and timber to the Russians as well when they're trying to set up this export industry. And so this leads to a huge problem. And around 1849, 1850, the Russians are actually don't have enough food. And they're having to get shipments from California, from Mexico, from Siberia in order to feed their population. And so I've read these sort of letters from the governor at the time, Tepinkov, who's basically sending these letters back to the main office saying, we need men here. We do not have enough laborers. Please send us more men. And he hears back from the main office and says, no, just keep employing Tlingits. They'll do enough work for you. And the main office doesn't understand that Sheet'ká Tlingits, are fine creating a trade relationship that works for them, but they're not gonna trade stuff for the Russians to sell it down in California and make a profit. And it's worth to mention as well, what are Sheet'ká Tlingits getting from this? Well, first off, they're getting money that they often can spend here in Novoarkhangelsk. Later on in the 1850s, they go and spend that in Victoria, and they actually trade down in Victoria, and they trade with other Tlingit clans. But they're also getting access to material goods. And for the Sheet'ká Tlingit, the Russians are the closest Europeans for them to trade with. And so that's how you get gunpowder. That's how you get access to metal tools. That's how you get calico cloth and other European trade goods. And so they're getting a pretty good deal out of this. And they're getting this, again, by just trading excess foodstuffs that for the most part they don't really need. And so this is a trading relationship that works for the Sheet'ká Tlingit, but does not work for the Russians. And that starts to lead to problems in the 1850s after there's this lack of food and there's this lack of timber. So this is also where the Russians get drawn in to Tlingit politics. And so I'm sure many of you have heard about the Nanya-Ai Kagwantan War. The Russians get drawn into that conflict. And so there's a conflict between the Nanya-Ai clan of Sheet'ká Tlingit and the Kagwantan here in Sitka. And the Nanya-Ai see the Russians as allies of the Kagwantan. That makes sense, right? Because they're trading all the time. They're interacting in daily life. It's almost like the Russians were sort of brought in to Tlingit politics here. And so during an attack, so the Nanya-Ai actually show up in Sitka around 1852, 1853, and there's a lot of tension between the Nanya-Ai and the Russians and the Kagwantan. And the Nanya-Ai actually attack the Russians at this place called Tai, or the hot springs. It's now today called Goddard Hot Springs because this American by the name of Goddard stole the hot springs from George Lewis's family in the late 1800s. They renamed it, and Russians are actually killed at Tai, and it's sort of such a shock that the Kagwantan are actually really worried the Russians are going to attack them for being drawn into this war. But sort of to credit sort of the Russian governor at the time, he doesn't. He doesn't try to seek revenge or anything like that. He tries to keep trading going on. But the other sort of Russian administrators back in St. Petersburg don't see it that way. They see this as, this is a story of Russian weakness. If the Russians were harsher on Tlingits, then this would have never happened. And so this governor by the name of Rosenberg is withdrawn, and a new governor comes by the name of Voyevodsky. And Voyevodsky is convinced that the Russian policy has been too lenient. They need to be more stricter with Sheet'ká Tlingits. And so the Voyevodsky actually bans Sheet'ká Anyadi, Sheet'ká nobles, from walking around the town of Novoarkhangelsk. And this was an agreement that the Sheet'ká Tlingit had with Russian governors in the 1820s and 1830s for a very long time. Anyadi were allowed to walk around in the colonial town and trade goods, often at a rock that was kind of near the harbor. And so this is where relations really take a nosedive, because the Anyadi say, okay, you don't want to let us walk around town? We're not providing you stuff anymore. And so they start boycotting the market, and they say, we're not going to give you food. We're not going to give you timber. And this is a problem for a lot of common Sheet'ká Tlingit men who, remember, have been paid wages by the Russians for working. And now they don't have access to those wages, and they sort of rightly blame the Russians for sort of denying them this opportunity. And so young men start coming into the town, committing thefts, committing arsons, this sort of thing. And one particular time, a Tlingit man sneaks into the town, goes into the officer's quarters. Goes into this officer by the name of Kashavarov and steals all of his clothes and kind of absconds with them. And so this is making Voyevodsky even angrier. He's like, okay, we need to be stricter. And so it's around this time that three Tlingit men try to come up to a firewood, some firewood that the Russians have, and a Russian sentry, stops them and says, "Hey, what are you doing?" and finds these 3 Tlingit men taking the Russian firewood, they get into a fight, and they severely wound this Russian sentry. And so these 3 men are arrested, or if they're not arrested, are sort of ordered by Voevodsky. He sort of orders a punishment for them. And he says, okay, that's it. This is the line. And he declares that they should be exiled from Sheet'ká, banished. And, that's a pretty harsh sentence, especially pretty harsh sentence. If any of these men were Kiksadi, that would have rang very, very harsh, right? Because this is Kiksadi land. And so almost immediately, the Sheet'ká revolts against the Russians. They say, no, this is it. We are not allies. We're not partners. You have broken our trade agreement. We're attacking. And there was this huge battle at New Tlingit. And it's a very close battle, actually. The Sheet'ká Tlingits almost take over Novoarkhangelsk, almost extinguish the Russian settlement completely around this time. But the Russians are able to sort of push back their advance, and after several hours that left dozens of Russians dead, around 50 Tlingit men and a few women and children dead, both sides come to the negotiating table. There's an exchange of hostages, and sort of this event ends. And the way this is often written about is, this was sort of a Russian victory. And if we actually look at what happens afterwards, we find that that's actually not the case. This is sort of a strategic Sheet'ká victory. It was around this time that there's a historian by the name of Jonathan Dean who argues that the Russians after 1855 are in fact Tlingitized. And Tlingit culture starts to influence the Russians, and the Russians really start to follow Tlingit law. They had already previously followed Tlingit law, but they sort of commit to it in around 1855. And the other thing we see is that actually Tlingit laborers begin working for the Russians even more than they did before the battle. And so effectively, the sort of trade agreement between the Russians and the Tlingit continues. And the same sort of oral treaty that was made in the 1820s and 1830s is reestablished in 1855. And this sort of confirms this is not going to be a Russian colony. This is going to be a Russian trading post in Sheet'ká territory. And that's what it's going to remain throughout the Russians being here on Sheet'ká. And some other interesting things happen. The Russians actually start to actually make a profit. And they make a profit through the ice trade. And I don't know if you've all heard about this before, but there was sort of a brief period in world history before refrigeration, but sort of in the mid 1800s, where colonial powers actually trade ice around the world to make sure that colonizers in warmer places can have ice often in their alcoholic drinks. And so the New Englanders actually kind of make up create this method for actually cutting out ice on freshwater lakes, cutting it out into blocks, and then pulling them down into an ice house, surrounding that ice in sawdust that actually preserves the ice, and then shipping it to other places. So originally they shipped it from New England to Louisiana, and an American company and some American businessmen say, hey, there's a lot of ice out in Alaska. What if we could making a deal with these Russians to ship this ice to San Francisco, where lots of people really want access to ice. And so they send out, this company's established called the Ice Company of San Francisco. And they make a deal with the Russian-American company. And they send out some horses and an ice plow to cut up the ice. And they send out an engineer to construct the ice house. And the Russians also start employing Tlingit laborers on this sort of project. And so Tlingit men are taught how to cut out and dislodge ice by this American, basically business consultant. And as you know, on Sheet'ká, the Swan Lake or Huatin Ak'u doesn't freeze that often, right? So there's a very short window for ice cutting here, but it comes at a very convenient time for Tlingit laborers, right? It's not during salmon season, it's not during herring season. There's not a whole lot of big production to do. People are often at their homes in December and January, and so this is sort of a great time for Tlingit men to come out, work for a couple of weeks for the Russians cutting some ice and send it on down to that ice house and then send it on out to San Francisco, and they can make a good wage doing so. And one sort of interesting thing as well, I found sort of some evidence that this is in the Russian sources, that this is sort of a time of almost like community celebrations. So it's often not just laborers who come out and work on the ice, because often times when it's the lake's completely frozen, it's often pretty sunny. There's some nice days, and so a lot of the community will come out and kind of play on the ice, watch people work, and this actually goes even into the American period, where actually I found some newspaper articles of people like setting up sleds and skating on the lake, while they're working on this ice company, and for the Russian American company, they can actually make some money off of this. So this is sort of how sort of one of those rare industries where Tlingit laborers and Russians are able to find something that both makes them both a profit. And so that helps sort of decrease some tensions. And so trade again resumes after this conflict in the 1860s. The Russians never cut off trade again, actually. They will always sort of keep this trade going. And the wood trade continues to be really important. That's how the Russians keep their town up and keep these building ups and continue to construct new buildings out here. But I want to sort of zoom out at this point and talk about the larger implications of this. Why do we go into the detail of this incredibly sort of detailed trade relationship? Well, because I think it shows it gives us some larger insights into the actual Russian Sheet'ká relationship. And, one key thing about this is this trade relationship effectively means that Sheet'ká maintains access and control of their resources in Sheetka, right? Because they relocated and lived right next to Novoarkhangelsk, they have access to Yaltei, Herring Rock. They have access to Krastihin. They have access to these important places where Kiksadi have gotten resources from for thousands of years, right? And the Russians are not able to take that land from them because they are here and they're living here. And so it's through the strategy of diplomacy and trade, actually, that the Sheet'ká is able to maintain control of their lands. And the Russians never have the power to actually take this place over. And I don't want to sort of, how do I say this, whitewash colonization here. If the Russians had the power to take over Tlingits, they would have, right? That's what they did to Kodiak Island. They enslaved Sugpiat, they stole men from their villages, and a lot of people in those villages starved to death because of it. But the Russians, the fact that the Russians didn't have that power is really important. And the fact that the Kiksadi chose to trade and choose diplomacy with the Russians, it was also very important because it prevented the sort of Russians from eventually gaining that power. And so it was Kiksadi and other clans of the Sheet'ká that actually determined the Tlingit-Russian relationship. And because of their choices to stop providing, say, timber to the Russians in order to export it off to San Francisco, or provide sort of excess trade goods, the Sheet'ká was able to maintain more access to their resources. And so the main sort of argument and sort of conclusion I have from this is that we can't just look at what the Russians did and how it affected Tlingits. We have to look at how Tlingits affected the Russians, because this was not a case of colonization. This was a case of a trading post that became sort of a mutual arrangement. And I wasn't necessarily going to go into the American period, but I just wanted to point out that this sort of arrangement continues a little bit into the American period. When the U.S. Army is here, they also started trading relationship with the Sheet'ká, where they are trading foodstuffs and they're trading timber. And the U.S. there's still contrast here. The Americans are still a lot more violent. They can bring a lot more forces up here. But there's sort of this brief period where this strategy of Tlingit diplomacy is not only successful with the Russians, it's also successful with the Americans for the first decade that the Americans are here too. And so this I really think is sort of a key thing to understand Russian quote-unquote colonial history here. So with that, I wanted to sort of leave times with questions. So here's all of my information. I'm very happy to sort of talk with you all. And as well, I want to sort of ask the audience and ask anyone here, I want to make the sort of my research on Russian documents and stuff accessible to the community. That's why I'm here. And so if there's any other place where I should sort of submit stuff or any ideas you have in terms of sharing this research with the community, I'd be very, very interested. So thank you very much for your time, and I'll leave some time for questions. Yes, sure. Oh, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Would you take the mic to the person with a question?
Of course.
And this is so that the videographer will get a good audio.
Yeah, of course. Hi.
Hi. Well, it sounds like, and I've studied this a bit myself, that the Russians were just hanging on. They really couldn't afford to stay in America, which is why when Secretary of State Seward offered, or they were made the deal to sell, it was a good deal for them, because the Americans could not have stayed here. And in a sense, you mentioned at the beginning that it was not really Russia that colonized Alaska. It was during the American period, which was much more brutal. And the Americans had a lot more resources for the Russians to take over. So do you have any thoughts about that with regard to your relationship and the issue of labor and work?
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's a great question. And there was actually a time when the Russian-American company in the 1820s was even writing letters talking about, should we just leave? And they got very close to doing so, actually. Around 1827, 1828, they're going to relocate the capital to Kodiak because of that exact reason. They're like, why are we here? We don't have food. We don't have timber. We can't even sustain this. A couple of things led the Russians to stay. One, I would argue, is this trading relationship. Without this trading relationship, they don't have enough food and timber. They're going to leave because they can't sustain a population out here. And the other reason is that this is actually a really good port, so it's a great place to repair ships, and they don't have access to similar ports in Kodiak. And so they're like, even if we take an economic loss, we kind of want to still stay here. But it was a very close decision because they weren't actually making a lot of money off of this. And so, it's a really, how do I say this? It was very possible they could have left and abandoned colonization of Tlingit Ani, and if they did, history would be very different. And I think that's a key thing. It's a decision of, oh, sorry, go.
That's really an interesting point, because they could have left.
Yeah, they absolutely could have left. And I think this is where bringing the story of Sheet'ká Tlingits becomes really important. Because it was Kiksadi agency to come and resettle here and reclaim their land and start this trading relationship that the Russians stayed here. I mean, I can't necessarily prove that, but there's a lot of good evidence that without this trading relationship, the Russians would have been gone. So, yeah, absolutely. Yes?
Gunishish. My name is Shannon Crosley, and I'm here to actually talk about clan house revitalization in Sitka. And so I'm so excited to hear about this this trade relationship and see the lumber. So my question is, did the Russians teach the Tlingit how to stick frame, how to build as they did? Because we all know that I think it was the Americans that actually burned down the village, the Sitka village in the 1870s or whatever, and then all the clan houses were built back stick frame. And then they say that Sheldon Jackson's the one that taught everybody how to stick frame houses. So my question to you is, did the Russians teach the Tlingit how to stick frame?
That is a fascinating question that unfortunately I found zero evidence about. But I think it's very likely that they did. And I think this is the sort of other thing. There were intermarriages. Tlingits and Russians were living together on a regular basis. They were talking with each other on a regular basis. They were trading all around the town. And so it would have been kind of surprising if that information wasn't passed on, right? And I'm sure Tlingits also passed on information to the Russians. Oh yeah, this is how you actually treat your wood so it doesn't rot, right? And so I'm sure, like, I would not be surprised if that was the case, yeah.
Ganesh Chish, my name is Nashak. I'm Kiksadi, Kagwan Tanyatki. I want to offer a perspective from my adopted dad, Father Michael Williams, who was a Tlingit Russian Orthodox priest. And it's really important in the context of the ability of the Russians to be here in Sitka, is that one of the ways that the Tlingit controlled the Russians in this place was that they were not safe leaving. So this is really important in terms of control of labor and access to forest and access to protein, is that the Sitka, the Russians, Anushi here in Sitka, were constrained in what they could do by the people here. And so when the Kiksadi came back, they came back and they set up right outside the fort. And they set up because they had blockaded the trade on Peril Strait after the Kiksadi survival march. So they came back here and they controlled the Russians in this place. So their ability to be successful was dependent upon the Tlingit labor in that way, is that in order to get things outside of the constraints of that small space, they had to rely on because they weren't safe. And I wanted to add one other point, is there was the other trade that was happening with other Europeans here that were coming in Southeast Alaska by ships. So for instance, my grandfather purchased a cannon in Klawock in the 1950s, a bronze French cannon. And the gunpowder and firearms trade existed outside of the Russians. So the Kiksadis here controlled the Russian, the access of other Tlingit clans, other Kwans, to gunpowder and firearms at Sitka. But they were still getting access through other European and American trading ships that were coming around southeast. So there were guns all around. And oh, I have one thing, one more thing to say. Just in terms of, who's teaching who how to do what. My experience is that the Tlingit people are very adept and capable and very observant. And so it takes not very much to see what's going on and figure out whether that's a better way to do things for them or not.
Gilchish, thank you very much for your comments. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that the Russians don't have the power to control any of Tlingit Ani, and it's because of those trade networks, and it's because of the choices the Kiksadi are making. Yeah, so no, I 100% agree, and yeah, I think that's a really important perspective. That's not just a matter of this trade relationship. It's also a matter of using force to prevent the Russians from expanding. And exactly as you're saying, it's both. And it's these trade networks that the Kiksadi and Kagwantan and other clans of the Sheet'ká Tlingit have with other Tlingit. Because the other clans of, for instance, the Sheet'ká Tlingit are trading with the Hudson Bay Company. And everyone's trading with each other. And the Russians are only a small part of these Tlingit trade networks. So yeah, thank you very much. Any other questions? Yes.
Gurchish for your presentation. My name is Victoria Johnson, and I just wanted to recognize in regards to the Kagwantans and the ones that had built these beautiful Russian Orthodox churches and this relationship that they had with the Russians in regards to their religious beliefs. Over in Juneau, that church as well was built by the Kagwantans. And you can see many of the older houses, and I love that she was talking about these clan houses after they were all burned down. These Kagwantan people helped build these beautiful, sturdy houses that still stand today. And so again, gonna cheers for your presentation and how that you shared it in regards to the leadership of the Sheet'ká people of bartering with the Russians and so forth. So the diplomacy was so important and critical. But then again, the sale of our property or our land, from that exchange, is still mind-boggling. So again, gonna cheers for your work.
Cheers, thank you very much. And yeah, that's an incredibly important point. That sort of Kagwatan's involvement in the Russian Orthodox Church is another big part of this story. So thank you very much.
Yeah, I just wanted to, the Russian buildings where they used logs, jointed logs for their buildings. And then after, only really, really late in the period did they start using, sawn boards, because it was so hard for them to, sawmills were always kind of funky. and that construction method that they had was, everything was jointed. It was like hand, it was like dovetails and, well, no. There was like the log building, and then later in the period they did start using sawn lumber, but it was like jointed, like mortise and tenon and everything. So it wasn't the type of construction that the Americans brought in. Yeah, that, what the Americans brought in was something else. And then I also wanted to say, technology, as far as new, better technologies, is viral. So it's not a matter of people teaching it, it's just a matter of, if something's a better way to do stuff, it just, it goes. But thank you, and thank you for your presentation.
No, thank you very much. I had no idea about the details of the timber, so no, that's really helpful. And yeah, and that's a really good way to talk about it as well. This is a colonial Pacific world, and there are indigenous networks and there are colonial networks, and information is just flying across this place. No, I think that's a great point.
Well, just one quick comment about another more benign aspect of the Russian period here was, and I wonder if you have other information about this, but it was the policy, my understanding, it was the policy of the Russians to learn the languages as they moved across from west to east, and when they got here, they didn't mess with the language. And what do you know about that? Because that was a factor.
Yeah, no, I think it's really interesting. So there were agents of the Russian Empire that were more interested in learning the language than others. And so what I've consistently found is that the Russian, ethnic Russian governors were more skeptical of trading and engaging with Tlingit people than non-ethnic ones. So Baltic Germans often, and Finns, are going out and learning Tlingit language. I've actually found there's a document that Governor Etelin wrote, which he actually understands some Tlingit language, and he's translating some of it into Finnish, or Swedish, actually. But then, of course, the Russian Orthodox Church. And so this is where Veniaminov, the translating of the Bible into Tlingit, and so some Russian Orthodox priests do know Tlingit. And the other thing is, around this time, there's enough sort of intermarriage between Tlingits and Russians that the children of these intermarriages often both know Russian and Tlingit, so they commonly have translators as well. So it's around, but yeah, that sort of curiosity to fully learn Tlingit is not. And I don't have any sort of proof of this, but I do know that I bet that there are common Russian employees who are trading with Tlingit people on a regular basis, and I think they're learning some Tlingit, because I found that there's actually some servants of American officers who are actually speaking Tlingit during the American period in order to trade. But they didn't write memoirs, so we don't know what they actually knew. But I would not be surprised if more common people were actually learning some Tlingit. Yeah. So no, that's a great point. Language is a very sort of interesting subject on this. So yeah, any other questions or thoughts? I was also checking our time. Yeah, it's almost time anyway. So, if not, Galashish, thank you very much for coming. It was a pleasure and it's an honor to speak to you today.